somewhere around age 60 without any injury, without a diagnosis, without one single moment you could point to and say, that's when it happened. Your brain quietly stops doing something it has done every night of your life since before you could talk. It stops going deep. Falling asleep still works, more or less. What's gone missing is one particular stage of sleep, and it's so electrically different from everything else that a neurologist could pick it out on a chart from across the room. It's called slow-wave sleep, and by 60, most people have lost more than half of what they had at 20. By 70, in some people, it's almost gone entirely. And here's the strange part. Almost nobody tells you this is happening, because from the outside, sleep looks exactly the same. You lie down, you close your eyes. 8 hours later, you wake up feeling like you slept. But something essential was missing the whole time, and your body has been quietly picking up the slack for years without you ever noticing. Slow-wave sleep gets its name from exactly what it looks like on an EEG, huge, slow, rolling waves of electrical activity. Under 4 Hz, sweeping through the cortex almost in unison. Millions of neurons firing and going quiet together in a rhythm your brain simply cannot produce while you're awake, or in any other stage of sleep. It usually shows up hardest in the first third of the night. And during those waves, your brain is doing something it can only pull off when nothing else is competing for its attention. The first thing happening is cleaning. Back in 2012, Maiken Nedergaard's lab at the University of Rochester published a paper in Science, laying out a plumbing system inside the brain that nobody had really mapped before, a network of channels running alongside your blood vessels, flushed through by cerebrospinal fluid, clearing metabolic waste out of brain tissue. They named it the glymphatic system, because glial cells are doing the job your lymphatic system does everywhere else in your body. Nedergaard's team found this clearance runs up to 60% faster during sleep than while you're awake, and it's tied specifically to slow-wave activity. Those fluid channels physically widen during deep sleep by as much as 60% in some measurements, because the space between brain cells opens up once norepinephrine drops low enough, and that mostly happens during those big, slow waves. One of the things getting cleared out is beta amyloid, the same protein that clumps into the plaques linked to Alzheimer's. That doesn't mean losing slow-wave sleep causes Alzheimer's. The research here is correlational, still being worked out, and it would be dishonest to claim more than that. But the mechanism itself is real, it's been measured, and it means that every night your brain spends less time in slow-wave sleep. It's running its cleanup cycle for less time on a system that's producing waste around the clock, whether you're asleep or not. The second thing happening during slow-wave sleep is chemical, not mechanical, and it runs through a completely different pathway. Growth hormone gets released from the pituitary gland in sharp little pulses all day long. But the single largest pulse a healthy adult produces happens during that very first slow-wave episode of the night. Often something like 70% of your total daily growth hormone, packed into the first 90 minutes after you fall asleep. That's not just a coincidence of timing. Slow-wave sleep and growth hormone release share an overlapping neural circuit, and work going back to Eus van Someren at the University of Chicago in the 90s showed that if you experimentally suppress slow-wave sleep, that growth hormone pulse drops right along with it, almost in lockstep. In adulthood, growth hormone is doing tissue repair, protein synthesis, cell regeneration, the maintenance work on your muscle and bone that happens every single night without you noticing, right up until you stop getting enough of it. Van Sommeren's later work also tied reduced slow-wave sleep to disrupted glucose metabolism and worse insulin sensitivity in otherwise healthy young men, after just a few nights of broken-up deep sleep. So you've got two mechanisms, cleaning and repair, both riding on the same electrical event, both losing time on the clock as that event shrinks year after year. Which raises the obvious question, why does slow-wave sleep decline in the first place? And this is where it gets more interesting than just aging happens, because there are at least two completely separate physical systems breaking down here, And neither one is really about the brain simply getting tired. The first is structural. Slow-wave sleep is largely generated in the frontal cortex, the part of your brain responsible for planning, judgment, complex reasoning, and that happens to be one of the regions that loses gray matter earliest and fastest as you age. Bryce Mander, now at UC Irvine, published research in Nature Neuroscience back in 2013 showing that atrophy in the medial prefrontal cortex directly predicted the loss of slow-wave activity in older adults, and that this reduced slow-wave sleep in turn predicted worse next-day memory consolidation, specifically the hippocampal kind, the kind you rely on to remember where you left your keys or what somebody told you yesterday. The tissue that generates the waves is physically shrinking, and the waves shrink right along with it. This one's well established, measured with MRI and EEG together, in the same people, and it's one of the more solidly replicated findings in the whole field of sleep neuroscience. But there's a second mechanism running at the same time, and this one has nothing to do with brain volume at all. It's about temperature. To fall into deep sleep, your core body temperature has to drop, not by much, roughly half a degree Celsius, but it has to happen, and it happens through a very specific piece of biological engineering. Your body pushes warm blood out toward your hands and feet. The blood vessels near the skin surface dilate, and heat radiates off your extremities into the air. That's called distal vasodilation, and Eus van Someren at the Netherlands Institute for Neuroscience has spent much of his career mapping exactly how tightly this connects to falling asleep. In his research, the gap between your skin temperature at the hands and feet versus your core, what he calls the distal to proximal gradient, predicts how fast you'll fall asleep more reliably than almost anything else researchers have tested. Warm someone's hands and feet without warming their core, and they fall asleep faster. It works because the brain reads that widening gradient as proof heat is successfully being dumped, which lets core temperature fall, which then gives the hypothalamic circuits that generate slow-wave sleep the green light to switch on. And here's where aging interferes with a second, completely independent pathway. Peripheral vasodilation, the actual widening of the blood vessels in your hands and feet, gets less efficient as you get older. The vessel walls stiffen, the nitric oxide signaling that triggers dilation weakens, and the whole system just responds more sluggishly. Van Someren's own data on older adults shows a noticeably smaller distal to proximal gradient at bedtime compared to younger people, meaning the body is slower and less effective at radiating that heat away, which delays or blunts the core temperature drop, which in turn cuts into the depth and duration of the slow-wave sleep that follows. This has nothing to do with the frontal cortex story. This is plumbing, literal blood flow through skin, breaking down on its own separate timeline, and both problems land on the exact same nightly event. There's a human story tucked inside this research that rarely gets told alongside the mechanism. Peretz Lavie, a sleep researcher at the Technion in Israel, spent decades studying what happens to people who lose slow-wave sleep entirely, not gradually, through aging, but suddenly, through brainstem injury or severe sleep apnea. What he documented again and again wasn't simple tiredness. It was a specific kind of unraveling, memory failing in a particular pattern, mood destabilizing in a particular way, recovery from minor illness slowing down on a particular measurable timeline. Lavie's work mattered because it separated what slow-wave sleep specifically does from what sleep in general does. Total sleep time could be completely normal while this one stage was missing, and the deficit still showed up. It gave researchers permission to stop treating deep sleep as just one ingredient among many, and start treating it as its own specific, non-substitutable process. Aging does slowly and invisibly what Lavie's patients went through abruptly. Same mechanism, just a different timeline. Now for the third piece, because there's one more system involved, and it's the one that explains why so many people over 60 find themselves wide awake at 3 or 4 in the morning, even though falling asleep was never the problem. Melatonin, released by the pineal gland, doesn't just make you drowsy. It works alongside your core temperature drop, reinforcing the same signal, telling your hypothalamus to keep nighttime physiology running. Josephine Arendt and others tracking melatonin across the lifespan have found that peak nighttime melatonin in adults over 60 can be less than half of what it was at 20, and in some people, it drops a lot further than that. Part of this is structural. The pineal gland calcifies with age, something you can actually see on a CT scan, and calcified tissue simply produces less melatonin than uncalcified tissue in that same gland. Less melatonin means a weaker reinforcing signal for a temperature drop that was already struggling to happen efficiently through the skin. So you end up with three systems: a shrinking wave generator in the cortex, a stiffening radiator system in the hands and feet, and a calcifying hormone gland, all converging on the same outcome. Less slow wave sleep, less cleaning, less repair. And it happens slowly enough that almost nobody notices the mechanism, only the consequence, which shows up as forgetting things faster than you used to, feeling less physically recovered in the morning, and waking up at 3 a.m. for a reason you can't name. So what actually moves the needle here, given that you can't regrow prefrontal cortex volume, and you definitely can't uncalcify a pineal gland? The answer, with the most direct experimental support, goes after the one piece of this system that's still mechanically capable of working, the temperature pathway, and it does it from the outside, bypassing the body's weakened internal signaling altogether. In 2019, Haghayegh and his colleagues at the University of Texas at Austin published a meta-analysis in Sleep Medicine Reviews, pooling data from 17 separate studies on passive body heating before bed. The finding was specific. Bathing or showering in water somewhere between 40 and 42.5 degrees Celsius about 1 to 2 hours before bedtime, for as little as 10 minutes, produced measurable improvements in how quickly people fell asleep, shaving off around 10 minutes on average compared to no bathing at all, which sounds modest until you understand the mechanism underneath it. The warm water isn't warming your core enough to fight against. It's warming the skin at your hands and feet and extremities intensely, and the moment you step out, that heat radiates off fast, artificially amplifying the exact distal vasodilation and heat dumping process that's grown sluggish with age. You're essentially forcing the radiator system to do, through external heat and evaporative cooling, what it used to handle on its own through internal signaling. The core temperature drop that follows is faster and bigger than what an aging body would produce unassisted. And because that drop is the trigger for the slow-wave sleep circuits in the hypothalamus, follow-up research measuring EEG after warm bathing protocols, some of it referenced in that same meta-analysis, found increases specifically in slow-wave sleep duration, not just faster sleep onset. 20 minutes, water in that specific temperature range, timed roughly 90 minutes before bed. That's enough to meaningfully engage a mechanism that sleep medications don't come close to touching, because most of those drugs sedate the cortex without ever addressing the thermoregulatory trigger that deep sleep actually depends on. There's a second, complementary piece of evidence worth mentioning here, because it explains why timing matters just as much as temperature does. Kenneth Wright at the University of Colorado Boulder ran a now fairly well-known field study back in 2013, sending participants camping for a week with zero artificial light and measuring their circadian rhythms before and after. Melatonin onset shifted nearly 2 hours earlier under natural light-dark exposure alone, and sleep quality improved without any other intervention at all. The lesson for the temperature fix is really the same lesson Wright's light research already taught us. The body's sleep machinery still responds to strong, well-timed external signals even when its own internal signaling has weakened, whether that signal arrives through light hitting the retina or heat radiating off the skin. Neither intervention repairs the underlying tissue. Both just work by shouting a clear instruction at a system that's gotten worse at generating that instruction onto its own. Worth being precise about what this fix does and doesn't do. It doesn't reverse cortical atrophy. It doesn't uncalcify the pineal gland or bring melatonin back to what it was at 25. What it does is compensate for one specific, measurable mechanical failure, a sluggish radiator, by forcing the signal through with an external heat source. The evidence for the sleep onset effect is strong and well replicated. The evidence for a meaningfully longer slow-wave sleep duration, specifically in older adults, is promising, but thinner, and researchers are upfront that there's more work to do before anyone can call it a solved problem. This is a real intervention with a real mechanism behind it. It's not a cure. Think about what was happening to you 30 years ago every single night without you lifting a finger. Your frontal cortex generated enormous synchronized waves of electrical activity. Your hands and feet, with no instruction from you at all, flushed with warm blood and radiated heat out into the dark. Your pineal gland released a hormone on a rhythm as old as vertebrate life itself. And underneath all of it, the channels running around your blood vessels widened by more than half, and a river of fluid moved through your brain tissue, clearing out the byproducts of a full day's worth of thought. None of it took effort. None of it needed a bath, a supplement, a routine. It just happened every single night because the machinery was new enough to run itself. It still runs. It's just slower now, quieter. And it needs a little help finding the signal it used to generate on its own. 20 minutes of warm water, 90 minutes before you lie down. That's not a trick, and it's not a miracle. It's physics, aimed at the one part of the system that's still listening.